Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being with us here today. We begin day 6 of the Kalaghoda Art Festival's literature section with a discussion between Arshia Sattar and Supriya Nair on the various retellings of the Ramayana. I shall quickly introduce our panelists. Arshia Sattar is an author, translator, and teacher. Her translations from Sanskrit include Tales from the Katha Sarita Sagar and Valmiki's Ramayana. She has also written a series of essays on the Valmiki Ramayana titled Lost Loves, Exploring Rama's Anguish, shortlisted for the Crossword Award. Ramayana for Children is Arshia's latest book. Along with D.W. Gibson, she founded the Sangam House International Residency Program in 2008. Supriya Nair, our second panelist, is the executive editor at the online portal Brown Paper Bag. She is also the editor of the Caravan Book of Profiles, released early this year. Formerly with publications such as The Mint and The Caravan, Supriya writes regularly on culture, politics, and sport. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Khurshid, for that introduction. It's my honor to be in conversation with Arshia about a subject that I, frankly, am a little bit out of my depth with, but that Arshia's own scholarship, her teaching, her writing, and her speaking about has helped me gain a great deal of insight, a great deal more insight into than I might otherwise have hoped. I spent the last few days reading some of Arshia's now classic translation of the Valmiki Ramayana. It's 20 years old, if you can credit it, 21 this year, over 900 pages long, and is a very interesting text for many reasons. Arshia has a critical introduction to this critical translation of a critical text, and I thought I'd begin. No, you know what? Let's not begin with that. Let's begin with let's begin with a little bit of biography, if you don't mind, Arshia. I know that one of your teachers was the great Ramanujan at Chicago, and I also know that, like him, you follow the convention of calling each version of the Ramayana a telling. I walked myself into a corner there. And Ramanujan prefers, as you'll know because you've read 300 Ramayanas, prefers the word telling to the words version or variant, because, as he says, a version or a variant presupposes an unvariant, an ur-text, a singular text, from which everything else is a kind of deviation, which he says is spectacularly wrong-headed for us to believe. And as we know, he's right, because the Ramayana has been, is a classic, it's an epic, it's a folk tale, it's been a bedtime story, it's been a TV show, it's been many translations. So
it's also a religious text.
it is a religious text. So in which of these forms did it first draw you in?
Let me talk about what Ramanujan said for an instant. He said this probably in the very late 80s or maybe the early 90s, and we take this completely for granted. This is what we think of the Ramayana, that it is multiple, that it is plural, that there are tellings and not variants. But when Ramanujan said it in the late 80s, it was revolutionary, because at the time, as with with scholarship on Western classical texts, Indologists, people who studied India, were looking for ur-texts. And in that sense, the critical edition of the Ramayana was created, and the critical edition of the Mahabharata. And I find, especially having worked with Ramanujan and Wendy as well, the things...
This was at the University of Chicago.
Yeah. And, now what we take for granted as part of our intellectual landscape in the 80s was like, oh, what are they saying? So, it's become domesticated.
Do you mean in scholarly circles, or generally in our general understanding?
Absolutely. It was, to suggest that it was ridiculous to look for an ur-text in regard of, Indian culture, because of the oral tradition, because of multiple languages, because of multiple hierarchies, to suggest that was... wrong-headed scholarship was a very, very, very big deal. And certainly your generation has completely absorbed this idea of 300 Ramayanas, right? But we had to listen and say, oh, wow, we mustn't say variant, we mustn't say version. We were learning a new vocabulary, not just of words, but of ways to think and ways to see. You know, I mean, in that sense, really, Ramanujan was like John Berger. You know, he taught us new ways to see texts, and he taught us to see structures and patterns within stories and across stories. So, in that sense, his work was exceptional, and I mean, it was sort of. I'm going to try and use a physics word. I don't know anything about it. It was a quantum leap in the way we thought about literatures. And so how did the Ramayana first come to me? Obviously as a bedtime story. I think it comes to most of us as a bedtime story. And then we sort of leave it behind because, you know, we're too clever now for stories in which monkeys fly and speak Sanskrit and there are 10-headed demons. And then we encounter it on television. You're like, yeah, I know this. But there's very few of us that actually go back to it as adults or to any classic, really. You know, it's so familiar that we feel like yourself. It's like, why should I read Ramayana? I know the story. But actually, we don't know the story until we read it as adults. So.
Right. It's also, I mean, there's also it's not a bedtime story like any other bedtime story, right?
Well, it can be. It can be a bedtime story like any other bedtime story, which is it has these, you know, these literally fabulous elements, you know, fantastical elements. So it's a great story to tell children as they go to bed. And I mean, this is something I've said so often, but my first memory of fear is from Ramayana. Right. Because I thought Ravana would come and take me away at night. So it's a great story to tell children. And of course, it's up to the teller whether they want to layer that bedtime story with, you know, theology and the idea of God and, you know, Sita as a goddess and all like that. But that's the choice of the teller.
Right.
You know, and it's also the choice of the listener. A kid might listen to all the sort of fabulous parts and forget the God parts, you know. So it's a dynamic relationship. Even when you're telling a child a story, never imagine that the child is just like listening. The child is also thinking and questioning.
Right. I suspect that the story of your own engagement with the Ramayana and how that's changed over the years might be, you know, might be a tale for the telling itself.
Yeah, I don't think that's a bedtime story, but it's a story.
It's resulted in several wonderful books. The latest of which in public that's out now is Uttara, the Book of Answers, in which you translate and explain and write about and think about the final kandam of the Ramayana, which is the epilogue. You've already translated this before in 1996 as part of this giant book, which we'll come to in a bit, perhaps. Tell me, and I did notice that you said in the introduction that you wrote at the time, I paraphrase here, the first and last books of the Ramayana are just not as interesting as the stuff in the middle. But clearly something changed. Will you take us through that journey?
Yeah, well, I grew up is what happened. This book came out in when I was 36, I think. I was 35 or 36.
The
big Ramayana
translation, yes.
And at the time, I mean, the sort of... David Devadar commissioned me from Penguin to translate it, and he said, we want 700 pages, so just abridge it to 700 pages. And I was like, 700 pages? Why 700 pages? And it was the best answer I ever got. He said, that's what our paperback binding will hold. And I've been using my edition now for 20 years, and I've been teaching from it, and it has notes in it, and you know, the binding is still intact. So I had to abridge, and so the parts that I abridged most heavily was Yuddhakanda, the book of the war, because it just goes on and on a bit. And then in my infinite wisdom, at the age of 36, I said, what happens in Uttarakanda? Nothing. He throws his wife out, so I'll put that in.
Can we, for people who may not be familiar, say perhaps briefly what the Uttarakanda is? It's the epilogue?
Uttara means many things. One of the things it means is after. And the Balakanda, the first book of the text, and the last book of the text, the Uttarakanda, scholars, rational scholars, who are not bound by, let's just say rational scholars, are of the opinion that the Bala and the Uttarakandas were written much later than the middle books of the text. And in the Bala and the Uttarakandas, that Rama is indubitably God. And in the middle books, it's not quite clear.
Right.
And it's certainly not clear whether he knows he's God, and people around him are also not sure. Unlike Krishna in the Mahabharata, who is God from, the moment he enters the text. So, I thought, nothing happens in the Uttarakanda. The book just tells the same stories over and over again. And the big event for the Uttarakanda, in the Uttarakanda, is the banishment of Sita. So as a 36-year-old feminist, I said, that's the only thing that matters. So I'm going to translate only that. And then, over the years, not that my feminism is diminished in any way, it's become more complex. And so I teach from this book a lot, and students would say, but what about this and what about that? And I was like, damn it, those answers are actually in the Uttarakanda. So then I went back to it, and I realized also that when you read a story, it's a political statement. Why do you choose to tell this story again? And some of it is very simple, if Hanuman was so great, how come Jambavan had to remind him that he could leap over the ocean? So the Uttarakanda says, because when he got all those boons as a little monkey, he became very naughty. And so the sages cursed him to forget what he knew until he needed it. Right? So those are relatively simple stories. But the big change that the Uttarakanda makes is with Sita. Yeah, that at the end of the Yuddhakanda, Rama comes home with her, they're in Ayodhya, it's a triumphal return, one imagines a happily ever after ending, and then suddenly the text says, no, you can't take back a woman who's lived in the house of another man. Right? There's also the killing of Shambhuka, because Shambhuka is an untouchable, he's a Shudra, and he's practicing austerities that are only meant for Brahmins, so Rama goes and cuts off his head. So what the Uttara really is, it makes very clear a patriarchy, it makes very clear a hierarchy, it implies a misogynism, it is pretty sort of overt about caste, and once that happens, and of course Rama is God, right? And once that happens, it forces you to read the rest of the text retrospectively. So the way you receive the text in a sort of innocence no longer exists. And then I realized actually that Uttara is the most important book of the Ramayana, because that is the book that's being used to torment us, as women and as, people of a different caste or a different persuasion. And so.
Do you feel, so in spite of the rational scholarly consensus that it is not the product of perhaps the same creative energy that produces, the middle books, the meat of the story, it is in some ways it can be considered a product of its time, of a history. In a way, the other books.
No, all
it's
the
a bit
books,
more complicated.
No, all the books are products of their time. Any book, any religion exists in history, however ahistorical it claims to be.
Right.
But one of the things that we forget also, that Hinduism grew in history, right? That Rama and Krishna and all like that became central divinities in Ramayana and Mahabharata after Vishnu's avatar theory developed, right? And that came sort of, even before Bhakti, right? So there is the text changes to reflect the times in which it is read and talked about and discussed. I mean, look at the people that are writing Ramayana now or retelling Ramayana now. Amish, Ashok Banker, Sam Arney, they're all doing 21st century Ramayanas, yeah? So everybody's like a shapeshifter, that's a word that certainly was not in my vocabulary before Harry Potter, right? But now people are shapeshifters and they are Sita, I have to say, I of all these, Ashok Bankers is my favorite, and Sam's standalone Missing Queen. But in Ashok Banker's, I think it's called Armies of Hanuman, that volume, Sita is like Xena, warrior princess, so the text is responding to the times, to the aesthetic of its time, to the politics of its time, to the gender of its time. So, and I mean, the people are like, "Oh, there are so many new mythologies, we're rewriting the epics." No, we've been doing this forever. Kamban rewrote Valmiki. It's not a translation. He recreated the Ramayana in a Tamil context, with the Tamil culture, and a Tamil botany and physiology and everything. Tulsi did the same with Hindi. Kriti Basa did the same with Bengali. It's what we do. When we love something, we make it our own by inflecting it with our own accents and our own colors, and it's
Right. And because we've been doing this to the Ramayana for a long time, perhaps it's remarkable that the epic, which I'm using as shorthand, so please bear with me, hasn't lost its shape yet. This is in spite of the fact that aesthetics change, and maybe this is a question for later in this conversation, the ethics kind of don't change or don't change to something unrecognizable. But what is then sort of what makes something a telling of the Ramayana? Is it sort of the basic story of like a man who goes to war, a moral man who goes to war to win his wife back?
That's $1 million question. What makes it the Ramayana? But when you're reading it, when it's a Ramayana. Like, look at Mani Ratnam's Ravana, right? He calls it Ravan, right? Because he wants us to bring our whole host of associations with it. And what is the Ramayana part of his story? That a moral man's wife, that's a policeman's wife, gets abducted by some kind of Naxalite, some completely disreputable creature. And there's a funny Hanuman and all like that. But for him, I think Mani Ratnam's film is much smarter than that, because Mani Ratnam is much smarter than that. But if you read Ashok Banka or you read Samhita Arni's Missing Queen, I haven't read Amish yet, Ayodhya is dystopic. Right, which I find fascinating, because traditionally Ayodhya is supposed to be Ram Rajya. It's supposed to be the best place in the world that you could live. But Bankar and Arni and all of that has seen it as a society of rules and regulations and strictures and constraints and morality. Moral police in both the versions of Ayodhya. There is actually something called the moral police, right? So I'm finding it really interesting, given the current environment in which we live, that the dystopic Ram Rajya is actually what is coming true.
Right.
I mean, some people think it's great, but for some of us, it's dystopic. So.
It is, and I suppose this very much the tale depends on the teller in this case. Because, as you say, there are a ton of people out there who think we're closer to Ram Rajya than ever before, and find that, pretty damn satisfying.
Yeah. I wanted to say one more thing. You said that the text hasn't changed shape. Essentially. Again, it depends who you are, because for somebody like myself, no, the text hasn't changed shape. In fact, the beautiful thing about the text is that it manages to keep its shape. Whoever it is that's telling the story, and whatever our business we're putting into it, right? But for a lot of people, it just changed shape in horrifying ways. And those are the people who want a singular Ramayana told in a singular way by a particular kind of person, an upper caste male person preferably, So for them, it is horrifying what has happened to the text. So.
And they're trying their very best to try and take us into a nostalgia for a past that never was. Asha, some years before you came out with Uttara, you wrote a book called Lost Loves. And I'd like you to perhaps revisit that, if you could, with us, especially in light of what you've told us about Uttara and the complexities it throws up about Rama, about his morality, about his relationship with Sita. And how these two books perhaps represent, how your feminism has mutated.
I know this is a terrible thing to say, but Lost Loves.
We encourage it.
No, it's a very vain thing. I'm not going to say something political. I love Lost Loves. I really don't think I'll ever write a book like that again. Lost Loves, well, as the title suggests, it's about losing love. And there are two sort of strands in the story, but the primary strand is that you can read Ramayana. And, we do need to read Ramayana as 21st century men and women, boys and girls. Some of us are feminists, some of us are not. But whatever it is, we are 21st century creatures with a 21st century approach to literature and to characters and all like that. So I think it's very possible to read the Ramayana as a love story, very tragic love story, because, so much of their time, they're separated from each other. But that's not the tragedy. The tragedy is that Rama has to put away his love for Sita because he has to be a good king. But what happens to Sita is even sadder because she loses her love for him. The guy who she was with in the forest is not the guy who rescued her after the war. In that process of losing her and fighting the war, he has become a Kshatriya, he has become king. But the wonderful thing about that is that she says, I cannot live with this lack of love, and so she leaves, when she disappears into the earth. So that's one set of arguments that Lost Loves makes. And the other argument that it makes, which is also quite, obviously I find it fascinating because I wrote about it, but is what happens to Rama in the forest. Because he suddenly realizes that he could be something else. And in fact, Shurpanakha and a couple of these other monstrous creatures that he kills, they say to him when they see him and Lakshmana, who are you? With the matted locks of the ascetic and the weapons of a warrior, right? So his semiotics of Rama is wrong. Nobody knows how to read him, and so they don't know how to act with him. And I think that's one of the mistakes that Shurpanakha makes. She said, you have the weapons of a warrior, you have a woman with you, why don't you sleep with me? And somehow that's, an unforgivable transgression. But I find it very, very interesting that Rama suddenly realizes that his life could be something else. And he works towards it, he's enjoying the company of the sages, and Sita is giving him these lectures on non-violence, and he's getting kind of, and then his wife is taken away. And he has to then become a Kshatriya again, and that is his great tragedy, that he saw another path for himself, and then his destiny just came and, So that's Lost Loves, yeah.
Right, but is it of a piece with Uttara in your mind?
Well, it's of a piece with Uttara in the sense that both books give us different ways to read Ramayana. You can read the text and you can enjoy the story, and then if you're obsessed with it, like I am, you say, oh, maybe it's this, maybe it's that. So in that sense, they are of a piece in that they are commentaries on the text, and that's, that's also a very old tradition that we have in Sanskrit of commenting on texts that obsess us or texts that we believe are important. But they're not of a piece because Lost Loves is about love and Uttara is about politics. So, yeah.
Right, that's where the... perhaps the time has come for us to talk about Ravan. And the role he plays in our minds, the role he plays in our culture, which is not something I was aware of until until I grew up, which was that he is a figure of fascination and veneration to communities that have considered themselves outside sort of the mainstream. Should we perhaps talk about him in the context of your work on the epic? And I mean, how do you feel about this guy? Let's talk about this boy.
Again, to my great surprise, Uttarakanda was more about Ravana than it was about anybody else. It sort of sets him up as a bad guy. He's always sort of raping women in the multiples, and he's arrogant, and he's like this, and he's like that. And again, that's...
So specifically, this is in the Valmiki Ramayana.
In Valmiki's Uttara, yeah. And again, I think that's... It's as if the text doth protest too much. Obviously Ravana has become attractive in some ways, so you've got to knock him down. And there's another sort of argument that I make in Uttara, which is a bit complicated, so I won't go into it here. But, Ravana, when Hanuman sees him in Valmiki Ramayana for the first time, he's just astounded. He cannot believe what he is seeing. And he actually says, oh dear, Rama's going to have his hands full. So he's obviously very, very charismatic. He's very powerful. He's a very good to his own people. And what destroys him is this obsession for Sita, and it destroys him, it destroys his people, it destroys his kingdom. But it's also very possible to... why did Ravana take Sita away?
Right.
Because Shurpanakha was mutilated by Sita's husband and her brother-in-law. So he does it, I think, in a sense of retribution. And then he trips over his own feet and, sort of falls flat on his face.
Right.
But it's also true that Ravana has become very attractive, particularly, from the 1930s, again, as a political figure, when Periyar recast Ramayana as, the Aryans invading southern India and, imposing their ways upon the Dravidians. So
right.
Ravana was the Dravida hero, and Rama was the Aryan hero. So there is, he's such a compelling figure. And of course, then outside the Ramayana, we are told that he is a great musician, and he's a great grammarian, and he's a great scholar, and, so... Yeah.
Pious Brahmin.
Yeah.
Just, always a bonus.
Yeah, but that is incredibly ironic that he's a pious Brahmin, because on the one hand, the whole Dravida culture's ownership of Ravana is anti-Brahminical, right? But somewhere the Brahmins got to get their hands on whoever's cool, right? So it's like, oh, no, he was a very pious Brahmin.
Yeah,
So.
just BT dubs.
Yeah.
So let's talk about Valmiki's Ramayana and the particular fascination that it holds for you and for us all. When you translated this in 1996, a year that I can see many in this audience might not remember with great clarity.
It's because they were not born in 1990.
It was a tremendously politically fraught time. And the decision to translate the Ramayana and the decision to translate this Ramayana must have been very charged indeed.
Well,
let's not forget that you are not an upper caste Hindu, North Indian male,
No. I think I have one of those three. Well, also, it came out in 96, but the decision to do it was actually in 93, which was...
even more politically fraught.
But, it was a funny kind of political fraughtness. You never thought that you would be in physical danger, personal physical danger, by doing something like this, because everybody was talking still. There would be tamashas and there would be halla gulla and all, but there wouldn't be murder and blood and, all that kind of stuff. And I think Penguin thought they were being really clever by getting like a rank outsider to translate this text. But a rank outsider who had the academic cred to do it. But, so in 96 when it came out, that's the really interesting part of the story. There was one review of the book because Penguin just dumped it. They're like, oh God, things have changed, So the book just disappeared. And I thought, as I think I was right to think, oh, it must be terrible. That's why nobody's talking about it. I'm ruined. But then, by about 2002 or 2003, suddenly people would come up to me and say, oh, I've read your Ramayana and I really like it. So the book developed a life of its own. And now, of course, Penguin is celebrating it. It's like, well, thank you. That's really nice. I appreciate it. But I remember in 96 and in 97, it was like, this is not something we want to talk about. So the book has had a life of its own.
Right.
Thank God. Because otherwise I wouldn't be here.
But was it an adventure for you to embark on this? For reasons other than working with the text itself, sort of politically, culturally.
Yeah. Well, I think I was so young. I know that to some people 36 sounds like you're already over the hill, but when you're 33 and somebody comes, the biggest publisher in India comes to you and says, we want you to translate Ramayana. You're like, oh yeah. If I'd been 43 or 53, I would have said never. It's too complicated. But I just had that, this sort of you feel invincible, and you know you're right, at 33. And then with each decade, you start to say maybe rather than yes, it is.
Right.
So, yeah.
And did you also feel perhaps that you were striking a blow for the Ramayana from against?
No. But I do remember thinking like, wow, man, what am I going to do with my ideological positions, But that I also felt when I was studying it in graduate school, because my dissertation is on Hanuman. That's how I got to Valmiki Ramayana, was through Hanuman. And I remember even in graduate school thinking, I'm so uncool, man. All the cool people study Mahabharata, and here I am, with the patriarchal text, with the text which is, boring and bland. Of course, it's none of the. I mean, it is patriarchal,
And
but it's not
pious
boring.
in a way
yeah,
that
exactly.
the Mahabharata is not.
Exactly. So I was more concerned about that, and I was thinking like, I'm a coward. I'm taking the easy text. So those were more my concerns rather than I'm going to reclaim Ramayana for the rest of us. Not at all. But then later,
Right.
by in the early 2000s. And I realized also that, everybody, all of us, myself included, who worked with Ramayana, in those 5 years, between 97 and 2002, 2000, we all just stepped off the public stage because we did not want to be associated with BJP or with Hindutva. So we all pretended that we didn't work with Ramayana.
Right.
And then suddenly I was like, what the hell? We've just given this text to the bad guys without even fighting. Then I was like, okay, no, we got to get it back. So
Right. The other retelling you were competing with that had come out just a few years before this text, of course, was the one that introduced me to the Ramayana, which again, many of you may not remember. Strange to think. The TV show.
right, which I missed entirely.
Right. And which I think
Yeah.
has like sort of been, I mean, it's like changed our last 30 years.
No, it's most people are younger, your generation.
Don't look for
people,
it on YouTube if you haven't seen it, please.
It's there, all of it in all
It
its
is,
glory.
but
No, but most younger people I know say, yeah, I've seen Ramanand Sagar and all that. And I'm like, I had, I was in the US, I was in graduate school when it was on television, so I'd only see it like when I came home on vacation, and
I see.
just like astounded by it, really astounded. But it is actually, Ramanand Sagar very cleverly called it Ramayana to make it universal, every Indian would want to see it and want to engage with it. But the text that he's using is actually Tulsi's Ramcharitmanas,
Right.
which is imbued with Rama Bhakti. And in that sense, for me, Valmiki is the more interesting text, because it's the first Ramayana that we have, but also the idea of Rama's divinity is unclear. And I find it fascinating, for a man who knows he's going to be king. First he gets exiled, he gets tossed out, right? And then he has this strange idea that oh my God, there's something else about me. So he has to learn not only how to be king, but he has to learn how to be God. And that's an incredible journey.
Right.
Yeah.
I feel like this is the problem that has perhaps kept you and possibly many other scholars hooked to the text. How can he be this and that? As an aside, and forgive me if this is cheeky, does the Ramayana or Rama existed as fantasy for you?
Oh God, no. I mean, not.
Right.
What do you
Perhaps
mean
it's also
fantasy?
sort of germane to this discussion because, as you've brought them up yourself. So many modern retellings do sort of see this as kind of a fantasy world that they can enter and play in.
No, I have to, at the risk of sounding like a pedant, for me it's an epic. And an epic is a very important thing.
Right.
And
And
it drives
very
me,
distinct from fantasy.
Yeah, and it drives me crazy when young people say, hey, that was epic, yeah. I was like, no, what is epic? Epic is not like, Virat Kohli is 21st century or whatever.
The modern day Rama.
Yeah. Oh God,
Yeah.
yeah. So I hate the use of that word because epic for me is, as you said, a very specific literary genre. Epics occupy cultures in very, very particular ways. They are sort of cultural vehicles. They sort of reify cultures and are simultaneously reified by cultures. So they're very, very complex things. And so for me, it is an epic in the best, fullest, most profound, most generous, largest sense of the word. So I don't think it's, as you say, it's not like going to, Wonder World or and just say, child, okay, I'm here in this little fantasy, and I can make this. It's not a game. You can't enter it and change it. In ways that you want, but
Except that people do.
Except that people do.
Right.
So again, I find myself sounding very conservative and very pedantic, but I am those things. I'm not conservative, but I am a pedant, and I'm happy to be that. And I think it's important for pedants to step out of their pedantry and be challenged, and put their books out there in a less pedantic way. But
Right.
it's sort of scholarly or. Scholarly sounds like I'm boasting, but
You are a
critical.
scholar. I think perhaps the time has come to own it.
Yeah, maybe. But critical works have to be out there for regular people to read, and they can hate them. They can say, "Oh, this woman is talking rubbish," or she's an outsider or whatever. But they have to read it. They have to be available. They don't have to read it. They have to be available as alternatives. They have to be accessible. So.
Yeah, which I think is a really great way of looking at it, and which is why Uttara is particularly exciting, as is the fact that you write about and interpret the Ramayana for children. In fact, what's it like to, again, to be this and that? You may know that Arshia's written about a book about Hanuman that's meant for younger readers. What you may not know is that her treatise for grown-ups on the same character is going to be published this year, and was in fact the subject of her dissertation. Tell me a little bit about walking that line, Arshia, if you will.
The children's Ramayana, it's been on my mind for a long time. Really. Well, I started working with Ramayana in 1983. Right, so that's like 30-some years. So it took me 34 years to feel that I could tell the Ramayana the way I wanted to tell it. So that's a big thing. That gives you some indication of what the kind of space this text occupies in our minds. Even those of us who live with it every day. It's not a casual decision to say, okay, I will tell children, especially the Ramayana. So it was on my mind and on my mind and on my mind and on my mind. And then my editor, she was like, come on, do it. And so I signed the contract, and I had no idea how I was going to do it because I didn't know how to address the idea of God, of Rama
Right.
being God. And then when I came upon a midnight clear, it just struck me. I said, I should do what Valmiki does, say it in the end, like Uttarakhand, and the whole text again. But it was... I enjoyed it hugely. The one thing that you have, and this is also, I think, a great exercise, that you have to work with a smaller vocabulary.
Right.
Yeah, but you never talk down to younger readers. It's great to use words like bombastic. They love new, funny words.
Great words.
Yeah. So you use a smaller vocabulary of words, but you don't use a smaller vocabulary of ideas. Because then you're talking down to them, and they don't need to be talked down to. The most interesting questions that I've had come from children. Like, when Jagannath was promoting the book, there's this brilliant idea of having a 10-year-old boy interview me. Yeah?
It was the best interview I've seen all year.
He had me. He had me in a corner. But the thing that I remember most about that interview, he was a complete stranger. I didn't know him at all. And he'd come with his questions prepared. And he said, why did Rama go after the golden deer? If Rama's God, how come he didn't know that it was a trick? And I was like, maybe because he forgot, for that minute that he was God, or
Right.
maybe he was bewitched by the deer. And this kid looks at me and says, no, he went after the golden deer because he loved Sita and he wanted to make her happy. And I was like, Jesus, man, 35 years with this text, and that is the best answer I've ever had to this problem. It was so spontaneous, it was so brilliant. Yeah. So, yeah.
Right, and again, so perhaps the magic of lost loves is that love is the thing that that transcends what is human and what is divine, and makes an already complicated story.
And this was a boy.
Even more complicated.
You know, I mean, not to like betray my own gender prejudices, but a 10-year-old boy talking about love, I was like, you're something.
Yeah,
you know?
someone's doing a good job. Okay, let me now come to what I said I would open with, and then decided not to, because I wanted to get to like other things first. I really wanted to read to you a few lines from Arshiya's introduction to the Valmiki Ramayana, which kind of sparked off all the questions I had for her for this interview. It's very short, and with your permission. The Ramayana as we receive it today, whether it is Valmiki's Sanskrit telling or the Rama story, is a cultural artifact, replete with all its multiforms in the performing and fine arts and different genres of literature, is more than a putative original or source text attributed to a legendary composer. The power of the Ramayana lies in the stories it tells, and it lives well beyond the confines of bound volumes. Each retelling is as integrally linked to the source as it is different from it. I read this and I thought, okay, this is like some kind of genius. It clearly expresses like sort of all the all the stuff that's going on in swirling in the conversation around this text. But here's a question that I think a reader of the Ramayana, who may not be represented in this audience, might ask you, Arshiya. Is the thing that links those two things, that makes it the same as the Ramayana, even as it is different from it, is that in fact bhakti? Is that in fact religion?
I don't think so. It could well be for many people.
Right.
It could very well be. But for somebody like myself, it's not. Maybe this is why I'm still with the Ramayana after so. Every time I finish a Ramayana book, I'm like, okay, now done. I've said everything I have to say. So I felt that after Uttara also, now I have to write this Hanuman book and then I'll really be done. And I'm already thinking, no. So I think it's because I cannot put my finger on what this thing is.
Right.
That I feel continually compelled by I think it's the story. I really, really think it's the story. It is so sad. Your father is persuaded by his wife to ask you to leave your home. You've done nothing wrong. Your wife decides to come with you. Your brother comes with you. You go into the forest. You're just minding your own business until some lady comes along and says, sleep with me. And then you stop minding your own business and cut off her nose and ears. That was not a good thing. Your wife is stolen away. You grew up imagining one kind of life for yourself, which is, okay, I'll be a king and I'll be a good king. Then suddenly, there's this sort of catastrophe, and then you imagine another kind of life for yourself. Like, okay, good, I'll live in the forest for 14 years, I'll become a different kind of guy. Yudhishthira has the same problem, right? He doesn't want to be king either.
Right.
And then they both have to come back and take over kingdoms. Rama's, of course, is very peaceful. Yudhishthira's, is kind of parched, and but it's a very compelling idea of kingship and masculinity and ownership and sons and fathers and all like that. And of course, central to this is the women. So I just always think that it'll help me understand us as a culture better if I can put my finger on this, but I can't. And of course now, since I'm sort of really, I think I'm winding up with Ramayana, I'm not sure. It's just like slapping me in the face how similar it is to Mahabharata. Yudhishthira and Rama are the same guy, you know. Yeah, so another 30 years, I think, if I but it's becoming very clear to me that these epics are dealing with the same thing, with the same problem. They're articulating them in different ways, but the problem is fundamentally the same. And I think that problem is how to be a man, not how to be a woman. So, all you guys should be reading it instead of telling me what it's me telling you.
Okay, I have a question about that, but I also took a look at your wristwatch as you were talking, and I realized that it might be time to open up and see if someone in the audience has any questions. Yes, the lady in the spectacles. I don't know if we have a mic, but yes.
Thank you. It was wonderful listening to you. I've read some of your books, Ramayana, Uttara, also The Mouse Merchant, which has nothing to do with the Ramayana. So I have two questions. One is, as an aspiring writer, I'd like to know your method of writing. You know, how do you research? How do you find out authentic sources? How do you know something is reliable, not reliable? So your process as a writer. And the second is a question my son often asks me, and I say I don't know. He asks me, is Rama real? Did he live? And I always say I don't know, because I don't want him to have a controversial bias, which I have. And I don't
Why
want
not?
to pass it on to him. He can make his own judgment. But what would you answer? A child that asks you, did Rama really live? Was Rama real?
Well, you know, I've asked this question all the time, and with very many different agendas, you know, like, hey, is it real? You know, and sort of like, but is it real? You know, and my response is always, it is a literary truth. Yeah, it's not the same kind of truth as the grass is green and, you know, the rose is red and all like that. It is a literary truth, and to me that is a much more important truth. It's an incontrovertible truth. There's no, you know, I also say that I'm so glad that it's a literary truth, yeah? Because what the Ramayana sort of just tells me over and over and over again is what a fantastic feat of the imagination. How wonderful that we're a culture that can imagine these things. Monkeys that speak Sanskrit and fly and, you know, all like that. I don't want it to be literally true. I don't want that to be like a, you know, maybe it's true that there was a guy who was, you know, exiled by his father and his wife was stolen away from him. But that is not Ramayana. Ramayana is Hanuman, who can fly and speak Sanskrit. Ramayana is 10-headed Ravana. Ramayana is Shurpanakha, you know. So that to me, it is true in that way, and in a very, very profound way. What is my writing process? I mean, you read the books, you know, and then you write. I mean, you write every day, you read every day. You can't write unless you read. And, you know, for me, what is an authentic source? I read Ramayana. I mean, I know I sound like a practicing Hindu. I read Ramayana every day, right? That is my source. The rest of it is, you know, yeah. So just read every day, write every day, you know.
Salil?
Yeah. I mean, sorry. I lived in Southeast Asia, and one of the things I know is that there are so many other versions or interpretations or tellings of Ramayana in Thailand and Cambodia and so on, with extremely controversial and different approaches to the narrative, which of course, if people in Nagpur find out, will have riots in Bangkok and Phnom Penh.
They'll send their armies to Jakarta.
Absolutely, absolutely. There is an Ayutthaya there. There is an Ayutthaya in Thailand. So my question is, have you looked at those texts, and is it likely that you might turn your attention to those and see the literary inspirations there, or if there's something that can be drawn? Are there parallels, or are they completely separate works of fiction?
Yeah, I had to look at them when I was writing my dissertation, because that's what you're expected to do, you know, look at all this other stuff. And I think some parts of it will come into the Hanuman book, but I don't feel like I can actually, I can comment on them sort of casually, but, you know, the reason why I feel like I can talk about Valmiki like this is because I've read it in Sanskrit, you know? I can't read these other languages. I'm dependent on somebody else's interpretation, somebody's translation. So for me, they'll always be like a very interesting addition, a very interesting counterpoint, but I cannot actually speak about... it would be wrong for me to speak about them in the way that I speak about Valmiki. I don't even talk about Tulsi. I don't talk about Ramcharitmanas. I mention it every now and then, but you know, it's not my text. So,
Ranjit?
Ashia, as always, thank you for a absolutely magnificent presentation, and Supriya for drawing her out. We've talked around this question before, but if you could just address this, and you put it so beautifully when you said the central problem seems to be how to be a man. If you could just link this to the question of Swadharma, in the way that in something as abstract as the Bhagavad Gita, it gets laid down as a canon. You know what you have to do because you belong to a caste. But whether it's Rama or Yudhishthir or Ashwatthama or Karna, people who are born with one thing and move to another, or who don't know what their conception of duty is, Could you speak to that particular kind of crisis?
You know, I've always found Swadharma very slippery. You know, Mahabharata says dharma is sukshma, but I think Swadharma is even more sukshma, more subtle. And I think because in Hinduism, we think of the self as relational. We are never an individual, yeah? We are simultaneously mothers, sisters, daughters, friends, wives, I think that's, sisters-in-law, whatever it is, right? So, and that I think is the problem that Rama and Dasharatha face, right? That their dharma as kings is in direct conflict with their dharma as husbands. And we inhabit these multiple dharmas simultaneously. So every time we choose to do X instead of Y, we are making one dharma more important than the other. That is not the problem in the Mahabharata. You know, the Mahabharata has some simpler idea of Swadharma, like, acha, you're a Kshatriya, so you do this. The problem in Ramayana is that it understands that we are complex. And, you know, so Dasharatha was not wrong in responding to the boons that he'd given Kaikeyi. Rama was not wrong in responding to his people who were gossiping about his wife, but so Dasharatha betrays his kingship and his people. Rama betrays his wife, right? It's sort of almost a contradiction in terms, but we have to think about inhabiting multiple swadharmas, you know, and that's why I think Bhagavad Gita, when I used to teach it, I'm terrified of teaching Gita, but every now and then I just have to do it. Now, always teach it as an existentialist text. What are you going to do, Arjuna? Because what you do is going to make you who you are. And now I realize that actually applies much more profoundly to Rama and to Ramayana, because what he chooses to be is a king. And that is what devastates him. His wife leaves him, he's left alone with this silly golden statue, and he spends his last years in just utter broken-hearted despair. You know, which happens to Yudhishthira as well. He gets, the kingdom. But it's what's to get, so... I'm sorry, I don't think I answered your question entirely, but it is something that I'm circling. And that'll be the day when I write a book on dharma, that'll really be when I have to, exit the kingdom,
I recently read an article which was totally in contradiction to Valmiki's Ramayana, which was Sankadarsha's Jain version of Ramayana, I think 5th century BC, which said that Ravana was actually the father of Sita. And that, there was the astrologer apparently said that your daughter is going to be the reason for your death, and he had her buried, and then Janaka found her. And similar versions exist in some other, very ancient 10th century BC texts as well.
10th century BC, no. Okay. 10th century AD maybe, but not BC.
Okay.
Right.
But I found that totally jarring and totally in contradiction to the Ramayana that, we've read in mainstream literature. So just wanted your take on that.
Well, that's what Salil was also talking about, that outside of this, what has become canonized Hinduism, there are many different ways to think about, the many different ways in which these relationships between the major characters are constructed. For example, Bengal and east of Bengal, Hanuman is anything but a brahmachari. Yeah, he's rather sexually active and has many little Hanumans, some of which he knows about and some of which he doesn't.
She's quoting other people, just by the way, for anyone who's watching.
Yeah, really. Quote somebody and you'll be safe. The point, again, I think, is that why do you tell the story in the way that you do, right? So whoever's telling the story about Ravana and Sita obviously has an agenda that needs to get addressed, that needs to be expressed, so that's all right. And what is so horrible, really, about Sita being Ravana's daughter? It's not like he ever touches her, right? So it's just... so I understand that you find it jarring and all like that, but jarring is fine. Jarring is not a bad thing. Be jarred, it's okay.
Ma'am?
Yeah. So I would like to know your take on Kaikeyi, because very similarly, my aunt is a practicing Brahmin who reads Valmiki Ramayana mostly every day. And she told me this sacrifice that Kekai made when Dashrath asked her that you would become the bad woman in the literature when she had asked to, send Ram to the exile. Because in the war where Dashrath had promised this, that I would give you anything that you ask for, it was the time when his original crown was taken away by Bali. And this entire story is about Ram going into exile to take the crown from Bali. So is there that kind of characteristic attached to Kekai, according to whatever you have read in parallel literatures or in the mainstream literature or in the original literature of Valmiki?
Okay, so here's the lovely thing, that every time I talk about Valmiki in public, somebody tells me a story I've never heard before. And this is that, Bali, the Asura, took Dasharatha's crown. Great, I didn't know that. But what is the problem with Kaikeyi? Yeah, if you think about, we have been tutored to think, she's the Sauteli Ma, she sent like Rama into the... What was Kaikeyi doing? She was looking after the interests of her own son. What is so wrong with that? So nobody in Ramayana is wrong. Problem with Mahabharata is everybody is wrong, and you know it, right? So it's like a simple text to deal with. Ramayana, nobody is wrong. But the consequences of what they do go terribly wrong, So, I mean, in a sense, like Nishkama Karma is like a better sort of... for Ramayana, because they're doing that, and this is why I really feel for Rama, like, poor thing, he really, really tried, to do the right thing, but every time he did the right thing, it went wrong. And that's
thank you so
that's
much.
terrible.
Thank you so much, Arshia, for speaking to us. It's been a pleasure to be in conversation with you. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Arshia might be able to take some of your questions off stage. And she might just sign a book if you have one for her. Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Supriya. Thank you, Ranjit. Thank you, Asa. Thank you for bringing me here. It's always great to be in this little garden.